What would you do if your own dad disowned you in front of 300 people on your birthday? For Margot, the humiliation was only the beginning. Within 72 hours, the scandals he tried to bury for years finally clawed their way to the surface. This is the moment everything exploded, and the moment karma answered louder than anyone expected. Stay until the end to see how a daughter he tried to silence became the one voice that exposed everything he feared most.
The ballroom at the Four Seasons in Boston was glowing with warm light that made the crystal glasses sparkle like tiny stars. Someone had hired a jazz trio to play near the back of the room, and the music floated through the air in soft notes that felt expensive and effortless. 300 guests filled the space. Investors, attorneys, old friends of the family, a few reporters who had somehow heard about the celebration. My dad loved a room full of important people. He always had. The waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays of drinks. The scent of roasted salmon and buttered vegetables drifted from the kitchen doors. Somewhere behind me, someone laughed loudly enough that a few heads turned. It should have been the happiest birthday of my life. I had spent the past several years trying to prove myself worthy of the company my grandfather built, and the party felt like recognition. My mom had chosen the flowers herself. Tall arrangements of white lilies and pale roses that lined the center of each table. She had been busy greeting guests all evening, smiling the same polished smile she used at charity galas. Across the room, my older sister stood beside her husband near the bar. Vanessa looked stunning in a silver dress that shimmered every time she moved. She had always been comfortable in rooms like this, surrounded by people who admired her. I had never been as good at it. I preferred offices and reports and quiet conversations. Still, that night I tried to relax. I had just turned 31. I had a respected position at the company, and for the first time in a long while I thought my dad might actually be proud of me. Then he picked up the microphone. At first nobody noticed. He tapped the side of the glass with a spoon, and the soft ringing sound spread through the ballroom like a ripple in water. Conversation slowed. Chairs turned. The musicians lowered their instruments. My dad stood near the center of the room in a dark suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had the same posture he always had when speaking to investors, straight shoulders and a calm confidence that made people trust him. I remember thinking he was about to tell a story about when I was a child. He cleared his throat. The room quieted, and then he said something that would change the rest of my life. He said tonight he needed to make something very clear. The words came out steady and calm. He said that from this moment forward, I was no longer his daughter. For a few seconds, no one reacted. I think people believed they had misheard him, but my dad continued speaking, and the silence in the ballroom turned heavy. He said I had betrayed the company that carried our family name. He said I had caused serious damage to the reputation my grandfather built over decades. And he said that because of my actions, I would not inherit a single part of the business, not one share, not one responsibility, not one place in the future of the company. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. Somewhere near the back, someone dropped a fork, and the sharp sound echoed across the floor. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. I looked toward my mom. She was standing beside the long table near the stage, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face had that familiar calm expression she used whenever uncomfortable conversations started at family gatherings. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply looked down at the table as if the flowers needed her attention. Then I glanced toward my sister. Vanessa was watching me with an expression that was almost curious. Not shocked, not confused, curious, like she had been waiting to see how I would react. The strange thing was that I did not feel the anger people probably expected. I felt something colder, something quieter. I placed my champagne glass on the nearest table so carefully that not a drop spilled. Then I looked directly at my dad. Understood, Dad. That was all I said. I did not ask what he meant. I did not argue. The room remained silent as I walked toward the exit. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor. Every step felt slow and deliberate. The ballroom doors opened and the noise of the party faded behind me as I stepped into the quiet hallway of the hotel. For a moment I stood there alone. The soft hum of the air conditioning echoed through the corridor. My reflection stared back at me from the mirrored wall. I am Margot Halstead. I am 31 years old, Director of Risk and Compliance at Halstead Strategic Capital, and apparently no longer a daughter. I should have felt humiliated, but what I felt instead was a strange sense of clarity, because the truth is that night had been building for months, maybe even longer. A memory slipped into my mind as I stood in that hallway. 3 weeks earlier, I had been sitting across from my dad in his office at the company headquarters in downtown Boston. The large windows behind his desk overlooked the harbor and the gray winter water beyond it. He had slid a thick document across the desk toward me, a revised risk report. I flipped through the pages slowly. The numbers had changed. Important warnings were gone. Entire sections of analysis had been rewritten. "This is not accurate," I said quietly. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "It is what the company needs right now. You want me to sign this?" He nodded. "All you have to do is approve the report, and if I do not—" His expression tightened. "Then you are choosing to stand against your own family." I remember the feeling in my chest when he said that. Heavy, disappointed. I closed the document and slid it back across the desk. "I cannot sign something that puts our investors at risk." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I did not fully understand until the night of my birthday. "If you keep pushing this issue, you will force me to make a difficult decision." Standing in that quiet hallway outside the ballroom, I finally understood what he meant. The ballroom doors opened behind me, and a burst of music and voices spilled into the corridor before fading again. Someone inside the room had started the band playing again. The party was continuing, as if nothing had happened. I walked toward the elevators. Each step echoed softly on the carpeted floor. In my purse, my phone vibrated for the first time that evening. I did not need to check the screen to know who it was. One call, then another, then another. By the time the elevator doors opened, the phone had stopped ringing. I looked down at the screen. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, my dad. I slipped the phone back into my bag and stepped into the elevator, because the strange thing about that night was not that my dad had erased me from the family. The strange thing was that he believed it would save him. And at that moment, I was beginning to realize exactly what he was afraid of, and that thought stayed with me the entire walk through the hotel lobby, out the glass doors, and into the sharp night air of Boston. The cold always hits you differently near the water, cleaner somehow, like the wind scrapes off whatever you were pretending not to feel. I crossed the valet lane, ignoring the curious looks from a few guests who had stepped outside to smoke, and made my way to my car parked along the curb. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, almost too steady for someone who had just been disowned in front of nearly 300 people. Maybe shock kept me afloat, or maybe some part of me had been waiting for this. The truth had been circling us for months like a quiet storm. Tonight was simply the first lightning strike. When I finally turned the key, my phone vibrated again. More messages rolled in as I pulled away from the hotel. "Margot, are you all right? Saw the video. Call me. What happened tonight? We are here if you need anything." Most messages were from employees at Halstead Strategic Capital, analysts, assistants, people who had joined the company long before I did and had seen too many things shift too quickly. A group that still believed in what my grandfather built. They were the ones who understood me best, because, like me, they missed what the company used to stand for. I drove through Back Bay, taking the long route toward my apartment on Commonwealth Avenue. The city lights reflected off the damp pavement, traffic had thinned out, and the familiar hum of the tires on the road felt oddly grounding. My phone buzzed again, but I did not check this one. Not yet. I wanted silence for a moment. Not silence from the world, but silence inside myself so I could hear my own thoughts without the weight of anyone else's voice. As I waited at a red light near Fairfield Street, my mind drifted back to the first time I stepped into the company building as an employee. I was 25, freshly graduated from Wharton, and full of that quiet kind of confidence that comes from believing you're doing the right thing. My grandfather had passed away the winter before. His death was not sudden, but it left a hole in the family that nothing ever filled. I remember my grandmother sitting by the fireplace, holding his gold pen between her fingers like she was afraid to set it down. She told me that if I ever joined the company, I should remember one thing. Protect the people who trust you. That was the backbone of how my grandfather ran everything. When I joined the firm a few months later, his values still echoed through the halls. Ruth Kincaid was the first person to greet me, offering me a cup of coffee and a smile that reached her eyes. She had been there since the 1980s and carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had nothing to prove. She showed me old photos of my grandfather at his first office, a cramped room with outdated carpet and framed newspaper clippings. He used to say that trust was the only currency more valuable than profit. Back then, Halstead's strategic capital focused on long-term investments, steady growth, and measured risk, the kind of firm that helped teachers retire comfortably and allowed small business owners to finally stop worrying about their future. That was what I believed I was joining. A company built on honesty. But all of that shifted when my dad took over. At first, it was subtle: new projects, faster timelines, more aggressive profit forecasts. I would hear passing comments at meetings: opportunities too good to slow down for, high yield portfolios that needed to launch immediately, risks that could be managed in the fine print. I tried not to judge. Change is part of any growing business. But slowly, I started noticing the tone in the office changing. Conversations became shorter, deadlines tighter. Instead of thoughtful discussions rooted in numbers and analysis, meetings turned into strategy sessions about how to package investments so they looked more appealing. The first moment a seed of worry planted itself in my mind was 2 years after my dad stepped in as CEO. I had been reviewing a new real estate development proposal. The numbers were polished, the presentation sleek, the projected returns nearly flawless. But the deeper I dove into it, the more concerned I became. Permits were still pending. Environmental evaluations had not been completed. Several of the construction partners listed had no proven track record. Yet the timeline suggested the fund would launch in less than 2 months. I brought my findings to the product development team. They listened, they nodded, they understood the concerns. And then they told me something that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Dad already approved the marketing draft. I asked why, when the project had not passed compliance review. He wants it out as soon as possible, someone whispered. I remember sitting in an empty conference room later that evening, staring at the documents spread across the table. Something did not add up. It was not the risk itself. Every investment carries risk. It was the urgency, the way decisions were being made before facts were in place, as if the process no longer mattered. Over the next year, similar patterns emerged. Energy projects with no completed feasibility studies. Tech partnerships lacking verifiable financial histories. Aggressive timelines that pushed analysts to the edge. Each time I reviewed the numbers, the risks screamed louder. But every time I raised concerns, I was met with the same stiff smile from upper management. Investors trust our name. That is all they need. My grandfather would have hated hearing that. The light turned green and I drove forward slowly, letting the memories settle inside me like dust that had been stirred up but refused to disappear. I took a right turn and passed rows of brownstones glowing with warm interior lights. Boston felt peaceful at that moment. It made what had happened earlier feel almost unreal, like something that existed in a parallel version of my life. But my phone buzzed again, breaking the moment. I finally glanced at it while stopped at another light. 5 new messages. 2 from analysts who had been worried for months. 1 from a board member who must have heard about the scene at the party. 1 from Patrick, and 1 from an unknown number. My chest tightened slightly as I read the preview of Patrick's message. We should meet tomorrow morning. There is something you need to see. I locked the phone without replying. The unknown number sent only one sentence. You were right to walk away. I considered the possibility that someone at the party had seen my face as I left and decided to send the comforting message, but something about it felt different, more intentional, as if the sender knew more than they should. I slid the phone back into my purse and pushed the thought aside. I needed to breathe before I could begin to untangle the knot forming around everything in my life. By the time I pulled into my parking spot near my building, the cold had coated the windshield in a light layer of condensation. I stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply, letting the air cut through the heaviness lingering in my chest. My heels clicked softly on the sidewalk as I walked toward the entrance, my mind still replaying the moment my dad's voice echoed through the ballroom. From this moment forward, you are no longer my daughter." The words were sharp enough to bruise, but something inside me refused to break. Maybe because deep down I knew his decision had very little to do with me as a person. It was not about love or disappointment or resentment. It was about fear. And if he was that afraid, there had to be a reason. Inside my apartment, I turned on a single lamp, the soft yellow light filling the room without being harsh. I set my purse on the counter and finally allowed myself to sit on the edge of the couch. The silence felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to think the next thought. Instead, I let my eyes fall closed for a moment. Images from the party flickered behind my eyelids. The shock on a few faces, the confusion of others, my mom's stiff posture, my sister's curious gaze. It felt like a play I had not auditioned for, performed on a stage I never wanted. But beneath all of that was something else, a pulse of memory from years earlier, when the company still resembled the place my grandfather built. I remembered standing in his old office before it had been renovated. He used to rest his hand on my shoulder while he spoke to clients. He believed in slow growth and honest numbers. He used to say that every dollar that came into the company represented someone's hope, someone's future, someone's trust. Halstead Strategic Capital had once been a sanctuary of careful decisions and responsible choices. Now it felt like something entirely different. And the night my dad tried to erase me, I realized just how far it had drifted from the values we once held. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. Whatever my dad had become involved in, whatever he had been pushing into the shadows, tonight he had made a choice. He had chosen to publicly sacrifice me before anyone else could question him. The irony was that he still believed his story held power. He did not realize that once a truth begins to surface, no amount of theatrics can keep it buried. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Tomorrow I will meet with Patrick. Tomorrow I would begin looking directly at the things my dad hoped to hide. But for tonight, sitting alone in my quiet apartment, I allowed myself to stay in the stillness, gathering the strength I knew I would need for whatever came next. But stillness never lasts long when your mind remembers things you have been trying not to see. As I sat there, the quiet of my apartment faded into the memory of a conference room bathed in fluorescent light, a room where everything between my dad and me shifted. It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels ordinary until it isn't. I had gotten to the office early, the way I usually did. The hallways were still empty except for the faint hum of the heating system working against the Boston winter. I always liked that time of day. Before the phone started ringing, before meetings stacked on top of each other, it was the only time when the company still felt like the one my grandfather had created. By 8 o'clock, the building had filled with its usual rhythm. Shoes clicking on tile, voices drifting from cubicles, the smell of fresh coffee floating through the air. I walked toward the analytics wing and saw a cluster of people gathered near the glass meeting room. Their faces were tight, worried. Ruth Kincaid stood among them, her brown hair pulled back, her glasses hanging low on her nose. She was holding a stack of reports pressed against her chest like a shield. Ruth had worked at Halstead Strategic Capital for more than 3 decades. She was the kind of analyst people relied on. Calm, thorough, honest. When she spoke in meetings, people listened because they knew she never exaggerated and she never guessed. My grandfather used to say that if he could hire 10 more employees with her integrity, the company would never lose a penny. Seeing her standing there with her shoulders pulled inward set off something heavy inside me. I asked what was going on. She gave me a small, tired smile. Executive meeting this morning. Something about the Riverway Real Estate Fund. My guess is they are not happy. That fund had launched with bold promises 9 months earlier. It was supposed to invest in a new development project in Arizona. High returns, strong early interest. The kind of fund my dad liked to showcase. But the moment the analysts dug into the real financials, they found issues that made the entire foundation shaky. Permits incomplete, contractors not fully vetted, environmental risks. They warned the senior team months ago. I stepped into the conference room and took my usual seat near the center of the long table. I had barely opened my laptop when my dad walked in. His expression told me everything before he said a word. He looked controlled but tight around the eyes, frustration hiding behind confidence. He took the head of the table and placed a folder in front of him. Executives filled in the remaining seats, their chairs stretching from one end of the table to the other. Some avoided eye contact, others pretended to review documents. The tension in the room pressed against my ribs. My dad cleared his throat and began speaking. He said the Riverway Fund was experiencing challenges. He said investor complaints were rising. He said we needed accountability. Then he did something that made every person in that room freeze. He turned toward the analyst seated near the far end of the table and said the failures in the project were due to evaluation errors. He said mistakes in the assessment process had caused losses. He said the analysts had signed off on risks they did not properly calculate. Ruth's hands tightened around her notepad. I saw her blink behind her glasses, not in fear but in disbelief. She had raised every concern clearly. She had documented them. She had emailed the senior team. She had done everything right. My dad continued speaking as if the truth did not matter. He said there would be disciplinary actions, possibly terminations. He said the company needed to restore confidence, and the analysts involved had compromised that. The room stayed silent for a long moment, and there was something painful in that silence, not because people agreed with him, but because they were afraid to disagree. Fear can make good people quiet. I remember feeling that fear myself, heavy like a stone in my stomach. But then I looked at Ruth. Her eyes were lowered. Her shoulders were pulled in. She looked like someone who had given decades of loyalty only to be handed blame for something she tried to prevent. That was the moment something in me snapped into place. I pushed my chair back slightly and rose to my feet. The sound of my voice surprised even me. Calm, steady, clear. That is not accurate. My dad stopped mid-sentence. His head turned toward me slowly. His expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. I continued speaking. I said the analysts had flagged the risks. I said I had seen the warnings myself. I said the problems came from decisions made above the analytics team, decisions that pushed the fund forward before its structure was ready, decisions rooted in urgency, not caution. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. Another looked down at his hands. My dad did not look away from me. He asked me what I was implying. I told him I was not implying anything. I was stating facts. I said I would provide documentation of the warnings that had been ignored. I said the analysts had acted responsibly. A flicker of something cold passed through his eyes, a kind of anger that did not flare up but froze into place. He asked me to take my seat, but I kept standing. For the first time since he became CEO, I challenged him openly in front of his leadership team, and that moment created a shift in the room. Some people looked relieved, others looked terrified. My dad opened his folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. He read something written there, then said the situation required strong leadership. He said pointing fingers at management would not resolve anything. He said the company must present a unified front. He was trying to remind me of my place. I sat slowly, not because he asked, but because I knew standing any longer would turn the moment into something else. Something he could twist. The meeting continued, but everything that came after felt like a shadow compared to what had already happened. He wrapped up by saying further review was needed and the analysts would remain under evaluation. People gathered their papers and left the room quickly. Ruth stayed behind. So did I. She approached me as the room emptied, her voice soft. You shouldn't have done that for me. I told her I did not do it for her. I did it because it was the truth. She looked at me in a way that made the weight of the entire morning land harder, a mix of gratitude and sadness and weary hope. She said she remembered my grandfather walking the halls his first year, checking every document twice, asking analysts not how fast they could finish something, but how sure they were of it. She said he would have been proud of me. Her words warmed something in me for a moment, but it cooled again when my dad stepped back into the room. I could feel the tension immediately, the kind that wraps itself around your spine before a single word is spoken. He dismissed Ruth with a polite nod. She left reluctantly. When the door closed behind her, he looked at me. He said I had embarrassed him. I said I had protected the truth. He stepped closer. He said leadership required sacrifice. I said integrity required it too. There was a long silence, the kind that stretches thin until it snaps. He finally said we would talk later and walked out of the room. But he did not need to say anything else. The damage was already done. That morning was the first time the people in that building saw a fracture between him and me, and fractures have a way of widening fast. Back in my apartment, sitting alone hours after my birthday had exploded into chaos, I replayed the meeting in my mind. I saw the way he looked at me, not disappointed, not frustrated, threatened. That was the moment I first realized he was willing to sacrifice anyone to keep his decisions untouched. Anyone. Even the people who had been loyal to our family since before I was born. Even me. The room around me felt quieter than before as that truth settled deeper into my chest. I rubbed my hands together slowly, my breath steady but heavy. I thought of Ruth's face, of the analysts, every person who had trusted the company to do right by them. My phone buzzed again on the counter beside me, a soft vibration that felt strangely loud in the stillness. I looked at it, a message from Patrick. We need to move carefully. And just like that, the memory of the meeting faded into the background as something sharper took its place. There were pieces missing from the puzzle. Pieces that needed to be found before anything made sense. Tomorrow would bring answers or more questions. I was not sure which, but I knew this. My dad was afraid of something. And whatever it was, it reached far deeper than a failed fund or a tense meeting. It reached into the very foundation of the company my grandfather built. Trick's message lingered in my mind that night, heavy and unfinished, and by the time morning came, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. I woke before the sun, the apartment still dark except for the faint glow coming through the blinds. Boston mornings in winter always seem colder when your life has begun to tilt in ways you cannot yet explain. I moved slowly, made coffee I barely tasted, and dressed in clothes that felt too formal for someone who had been publicly cut from her own family less than a day earlier. Then I headed out into the quiet streets and drove toward Beacon Hill, where Patrick had asked me to meet him. He chose a small cafe tucked between two brick buildings. The kind of place where people came to read newspapers and forget the world existed for a little while. I spotted him through the window before I stepped inside. He was sitting alone at a corner table, his shoulders hunched slightly and his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose as he read from a folder. He looked older than he had the last time I saw him, tired in a way I recognized all too well. I walked in, and the bell over the door chimed softly. He looked up and gave a half smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "Morning, Margot." I sat across from him. "Morning." He glanced around the cafe before lowering his voice. "I figured this would be safer than the office." I nodded. The office felt different now, more like a battlefield than a workplace. And after what happened at my birthday party the night before, it was clear that whatever invisible line had existed between my dad and me had been crossed in public. Patrick folded the folder shut and pushed his coffee aside. "I know you went through hell last night. I saw the videos people were sharing. I am sorry." I appreciated his sympathy, but I did not want to talk about the party. Not yet. There were other things we needed to address. "What did you find?" I asked. Before he answered, something inside me flickered with memory. A moment from months earlier when the first real crack between my dad and me had begun to show. A moment that felt small at first but grew into something large enough to reshape everything. I had been called into his office early that afternoon. Sunlight reflected off the harbor behind him, casting bright streaks on the hardwood floor. He had a document on his desk, thick and bound, with pages that looked freshly revised. He told me to sit. He slid the document across the desk toward me. My eyes moved over the numbers, the charts, the summaries, and for a moment I thought there had been a mistake. The risk indicators were missing. The red flags were softened or gone entirely. An entire section about contractor instability had vanished. Dad watched me closely. "That report will go to investors by the end of the week," he said. I looked up at him. "This is not correct." He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "It is correct enough." Those words stayed with me. Correct enough. It was the kind of phrase that slid quietly into the space between what is real and what is convenient. He tapped the document again. "All you need to do is sign off on it." The room felt suddenly smaller. I shook my head slowly. "I cannot sign something that hides material risk." His expression tightened. "The signature of the Director of Risk and Compliance is required." I kept my voice steady. Then it will have to be required of someone else. He stared at me, the silence growing heavier between us. He said if I refused, I would make things worse for the company. He said loyalty was part of leadership. He said sometimes facts needed adjusting for the greater good. I pushed the report back toward him. Adjusting facts is not leadership. The muscle in his jaw twitched. We are not done talking about this. But I stood up anyway. For the first time, I walked out of his office without waiting for him to dismiss me. That memory pulled itself forward now as I sat in the cafe facing Patrick. He cleared his throat. Margot, you were right not to sign anything. I waited. He opened the folder he had brought, the same folder he had been reading when I arrived. There were spreadsheets and transaction logs, highlighted entries, and copies of wire transfers that looked too intentional to be mistakes. He leaned closer. I had been looking at some of the financial activity tied to those new funds, not the surface level movements, the deeper layers, the transfers that do not show up in the general review. Something cold swept through me. What did you find? He hesitated, then flipped to a page with a printed wire transfer. Money had moved from the Riverway Fund into a consulting company based in Nevada. The name meant nothing to me at first. I looked up at him. He nodded. That company was created 18 months ago. It has no employees, no website, no tax footprint, nothing. My stomach tightened. Where did the money go after that? He flipped through another page. It was divided into several smaller transactions, all routed into additional entities. Shells. I exhaled slowly. And these entities belong to who? He lowered his voice even more. That is the part I cannot verify yet. I felt the familiar pressure in my chest, a heaviness that signaled everything was bigger than I wanted it to be. Who else knows about this? I asked. No one, just me. And now you. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with his thumb. I think your dad has been using the new investment products to move money quietly. Maybe not everything. Maybe just enough so no one notices unless they dig deeper. The cafe around us felt suddenly distant, as if the conversations and clinking cups belonged to another world entirely. I sat back in my chair. He nearly fired an analyst to distract from a fund he should not have approved. He publicly disowned me in front of 300 people. If this is what he is hiding, what else is there? Patrick hesitated. I cannot confirm anything yet, but I think he is creating a shadow financial network, something completely off the books. A breath left my chest in something closer to disbelief than surprise. My dad had always cared about image, about standing, about prestige. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, calculated, dangerous. I stared at the folder. Show me all of it. He pushed the documents across the table. These are only preliminary findings. But the more I look, the more concerned I become. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The cafe noise hummed softly in the background. Someone laughed near the counter. Outside, a cold wind swept along the narrow street, scattering a few dry leaves. Patrick finally spoke again. What did he say to you before the party? I felt my jaw tighten, that I was making things harder for the company, that I was choosing the wrong side. Patrick nodded slowly. And last night he tried to erase you from the narrative. I swallowed. Yes. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. That means he knows something is coming, something he cannot stop. My heart gave a small, painful thud. Like what? Patrick looked down at the documents. If any regulators start digging, they will find these transfers and follow the trail. It will not take long for questions to surface. Maybe they already have. The thought hit me harder than I expected. The timing, his urgency, his anger, his decision to cast me aside. Patrick reached for his cup but set it back down without drinking. Margot, I need to know if you plan to stay involved. If you step back, this stays between us. But if you do not, things could get difficult. I considered his words. Not for long. I already knew my answer. I am not backing away. His eyes softened with something like respect and fear combined. Then we will need to be careful. I nodded. I know. We sat in silence for a beat, an uneasy understanding settling between us. But inside my mind, a different memory rose. The one from my dad's office when he had slid that altered risk report toward me. A small action at the time, but one that marked the shift in him. The willingness to rewrite truth. the willingness to silence people, the willingness to reshape reality for convenience. Signing that document would have tied me to whatever he was doing. It would have made me complicit. Refusing it had made me a liability, and last night he had neutralized that liability in the most public way possible. I looked out the window of the cafe, watching a woman in a long coat walking her dog along the edge of the brick sidewalk. The morning light had begun to brighten the street, casting faint gold across the buildings. Patrick closed the folder and straightened. "There is more I need to verify. Give me a day or two, I will reach out again." I nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated before standing. "Whatever happens next, be careful." He is not thinking clearly. People make dangerous choices when they feel cornered. I felt a chill slip through me, even though the cafe was warm. When he left, I stayed at the table, staring at the folder he had given me. I did not open it again, but the weight of it sat in front of me like a quiet warning. A confirmation that everything I feared was real, and everything my dad had done so far was only the beginning. Eventually I stood, gathered my things, and stepped outside. The cold morning air hit my face, crisp and sharp. As I walked toward my car, I felt the first real hint of what lay ahead, not just suspicion, but truth, trying to break through the surface. My dad was afraid, and the reasons were starting to reveal themselves, piece by piece, in a way I could no longer ignore. That thought followed me all the way back to my car. The cold pressed against my coat as I walked, yet my mind felt even colder. I sat in the driver's seat and rested my hands on the steering wheel, letting the weight of everything Patrick had shown me settle into my chest. Suspicious transfers, shell companies, money moving without a trace of legitimacy, and somehow all of it tied back to the investment products my dad had been pushing so aggressively. I started the engine and drove through the narrow streets of Beacon Hill, the brick sidewalks lined with patches of thin snow. The city had begun to wake up. People walked their dogs, carried coffee cups, hurried to jobs that did not require them to confront the collapse of their own families. I envied them for a moment. Then I turned onto a larger street and let the flow of traffic pull me downtown. At a red light, I glanced at the folder Patrick had placed in my passenger seat. It sat there like a silent passenger, heavier than paper should ever feel. My mind pulled up the earliest hint I had seen of any of this, long before I understood how deep the problems went. It was nearly a year earlier, during a meeting for a technology partnership fund. The conference room had been filled with enthusiasm, screens glowing with charts, executives predicting returns that sounded too smooth to be real. My dad had pushed for the fund to launch quickly, insisting the market would shift if we waited even a month. But the analysts had found inconsistencies in the startup's financial records. Missing vendor confirmations, unusual valuation jumps that did not match industry patterns. When I asked questions, the room went quiet. Then someone in senior management said that investors were excited, and that was what mattered. I remembered walking out of that meeting feeling an unease I could not quite name. Back then, I thought it was just frustration with the new direction the company was taking. Fast growth, high pressure, decisions made in polished boardrooms before any risk review was even completed. Months later, when the energy fund appeared with similar gaps and rushed timelines, the unease grew stronger. But each time I tried to slow things down, I was told the same thing. Investors trust our name. There is no reason to create delays. Now, driving through Boston traffic, I understood those moments were not isolated incidents. They were signals, early warning signs of something deliberate, the kind of pattern you only see when you look backward long enough. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I waited until I reached another red light before checking it. A message from one of the junior analysts. "Just checking you are okay." A simple line, but it carried weight. These were people who had been pushed to the edge, trying to make sense of chaotic timelines and confusing directives. People who had trusted in the company's integrity because they believed in my grandfather's vision. People my dad was now ready to sacrifice. I typed a short reply and put the phone away. My exit approached, and I turned onto the road that led toward the office district. I was not planning to go inside Halstead's strategic capital, not after what happened at the party, not knowing whispers would follow me. But I needed to drive past it. I needed to see the building with my own eyes, the one my grandfather walked through for decades, the one my dad now used as a shield for his own ambitions. The building was tall and glass-fronted, catching the gray morning light. Employees were heading inside, bundled in coats, clutching thermoses of coffee. Life continued as if nothing had shaken the ground beneath it. I pulled over for a moment and watched them walk in. Some of those faces had been in the ballroom last night. Some had seen everything. As I sat there, I remembered the first time suspicious transfers had shown up in a routine review. Not the deep dive Patrick had just done, but a simple surface check I performed before approving a quarterly summary. It had been nearly 6 months ago. A payment listed as consulting fees. The amount small enough not to trigger an automatic review, but peculiar enough to catch my eye. The vendor name looked unfamiliar, yet not unusual enough to raise immediate alarm. I remember circling it with a pen and writing a note to revisit it later, but later had been swallowed by meetings, by deadlines, by the pressure my dad placed on me to move faster than the numbers could keep up with. Only now did I see how those small transactions were breadcrumbs. If I had followed them more aggressively then, maybe the picture would have revealed itself sooner. Maybe I could have confronted it in private before it reached this point. But then again, maybe this was always where it was going. I pulled back into traffic and headed toward my apartment. I needed space to think, to review the documents Patrick had given me in privacy. My mind kept circling one thought. If these shell companies were receiving money from multiple funds, not just one, then the scale of what my dad was doing was far larger than I had imagined. At home, I carried the folder inside like it was something fragile, something that could break if I mishandled it. I placed it on the kitchen counter, made myself a cup of tea I knew I would not finish, and opened the first page. Dozens of transactions stared back at me, all written in a way that looked legitimate at first glance. All small enough to blend into the noise of financial movement. But the pattern became clearer the more I studied it. Funds transferring money to consulting companies with no digital footprint. Those companies split the money into smaller amounts. Those smaller amounts were sent to other entities with similarly empty records, and then the trail went dark. Someone had put effort into designing this network, enough layers to deter auditors, enough complexity to make anyone think twice before digging further, enough movement to hide intention. It was not sloppy, it was intentional. I turned the page and saw more transfers tied to another fund. 2 energy projects, 1 real estate investment, 1 technology partnership. Each of them had been pushed through with urgency. Each had bypassed traditional review steps. Each had been part of those meetings where I felt pressure to approve risk faster than analysis could support. A faint ache settled behind my eyes. I closed the folder and pressed my fingertips against the counter. My dad had always been ambitious, driven. But this was not ambition. This was manipulation. A quiet rerouting of money, thread by thread, until the fabric beneath the company's surface was no longer recognizable. A soft buzz came from my phone. Another message. It was from Ruth. She said she had heard something strange in the office that morning. People whisper. People avoid eye contact. Someone claiming senior management was preparing to restructure parts of the analytics team. Someone else mentioned external inquiries. I typed back quickly. Stay calm. I will explain soon. Then I slid the phone aside. My mind drifted back again to the moment I had first sensed something was wrong with the Riverway Fund. 9 months earlier. A meeting filled with excitement, bright projections, confident voices. The development timeline made no sense. My questions were brushed aside, but what I remembered most was the moment my dad spoke. He had said the opportunity was too strong to slow down. He had said investors were drawn to momentum. He had said delays would damage confidence. His voice had carried so much certainty that the room fell silent, and in that silence, caution died. Now, with these documents sprawled across my counter, I understood why urgency had mattered so much to him. Urgency was a great tool for hiding things. It kept people focused on deadlines instead of details. It kept questions at bay. I picked up the folder again and examined a specific transfer, one that had moved $500,000 from a fund tied to an energy project. The consulting company it went to had been created only 2 months prior. That company had then split the funds in 3 directions within 48 hours. It was like trying to follow a single drop of water as it scattered across a river. The more I studied, the more it became undeniable. This was not negligence, this was architecture. The hum of the heater filled the quiet of my apartment. Outside, the sky had turned a soft, muted gray. I could hear the faint sounds of traffic drifting from the street below. A normal day in Boston, completely ordinary. But nothing inside me felt ordinary anymore. I took a breath and leaned back, running my hands through my hair. My dad had built a system designed to survive scrutiny, but systems like this never last forever. The truth always finds the cracks. A soft knock startled me. I froze. Then the knock came again, gentle but firm. I placed the folder under a stack of magazines and walked quietly toward the door. When I opened it, I felt the air shift in a way I could not quite name, and the next moment made it clear that whatever was unfolding had only just begun. But before I could process any of that, before I could even consider what might come next, my mind pulled me sharply backward to a conversation I had been trying not to replay. A conversation that had happened exactly one day before my 31st birthday, the day before everything in my life split apart. It had started with a message from my dad's assistant asking me to come to his office at 3 o'clock. Nothing unusual about that. My dad loved meetings. He loved control. He loved being the center of movement inside that building. But something in the wording of the message felt tighter, as if the assistant herself knew the conversation would not be simple. By the time I walked into the office, the early afternoon sun had shifted across the harbor. Light spilled across the floor in long, bright patterns, making the room look warmer than it felt. My dad was standing near the window with his back to me, hands in his pockets. He did not turn when I entered. I closed the door softly behind me. "Dad." He nodded slightly, still looking out at the water. "Sit." There was no warmth in his tone, not even the practiced politeness he used with strangers. I sat in the chair across from his desk, the one I had sat in hundreds of times since joining the company. But that afternoon the chair felt different, smaller somehow, as if the room itself had shrunk around me. He finally turned. His face was hard to read, controlled but tense beneath the surface. He walked toward his desk and rested his hands on it. Then he said something that caught me off guard, not because of the words themselves, but because of the exhaustion hidden beneath them. "You are causing unnecessary disruption." I blinked, unsure which part of his world I had disrupted more. The altered risk report I refused to sign. The meeting where I defended the analysts. The questions I kept asking even after I was told to stop. I kept my voice calm. "I am doing my job, nothing more." His eyes narrowed. "Your job is to support the company, not slow it down." I leaned forward slightly. "Slow it down from doing what exactly?" He took a breath and let it out through his nose. It was the kind of controlled breath a person uses to keep themselves from snapping. "I am telling you for your own good. You need to stop digging into issues that are being handled." Being handled. The same phrase senior management had used. The same phrase people whispered in hallways whenever something did not make sense. I asked him what issues he meant. He paused for a long moment before answering. "The investment line has been under pressure. There are things happening internally that do not require your involvement. You asking too many questions only complicates matters." I stared at him. "Investors are asking about missing documentation. Analysts are raising concerns. There are transactions that do not match known vendors. If I ignore that, I am not doing my job." He straightened. His shoulders stiffened the way they always did before he delivered something final, something that was not to be challenged. "You need to remember your place." The words landed with a weight that pressed into my ribs. I remembered a time when my grandfather would tell me the exact opposite, when he would say the company needed people who asked hard questions. People who did not fold under pressure. People who remembered who they were. I lifted my chin slightly. "My place is protecting the integrity of the company." For a moment, just one, I saw something flicker in his expression. Fear, or maybe anger disguised as fear. Then it vanished. He walked around the desk and stood directly in front of me. His voice dropped. "If you continue down this path, you will force me to make a difficult decision." The room felt even smaller. "What decision is that?" I asked quietly. He did not answer right away. He paced once behind his chair and stopped with his back turned to me. Finally he said, I will do what is necessary to protect this company. The statement was vague enough to sound professional, but sharp enough to feel like a threat. The kind of threat someone uses when they want to keep their hands clean while forcing others into silence. I stood slowly. If what you are doing harms employees or investors, you are not protecting the company, Dad. You are destroying it. His shoulders tightened, and when he turned toward me, his face was unreadable. Leave. We will discuss this after the weekend. I nodded once, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. The conversation was over. He had decided that. He had also decided something else. Something he did not say out loud, but made clear with the way he looked at me. He saw me as a threat. I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. The silence between us felt thick enough to hold every unanswered question. I said one last thing before stepping out. Whatever you think is coming, burying the truth will not stop it. His jaw clenched, but he did not turn around. The door clicked shut behind me, and the cold air of the hallway hit my skin like a warning. I did not understand everything in that moment, but I understood enough. Enough to feel the distance between us widening in a way that could no longer be repaired. That conversation played on a loop in my mind as I stood inside my apartment now, staring at the closed door I had just opened. The knock had pulled me back into the present, but the memory clung to me like smoke. I exhaled slowly and forced myself to focus. Standing in the hallway outside my apartment was not who I expected. It was my neighbor, a woman in her 60s who lived 2 doors down. She wore a fleece jacket and held a package in her hands. "Sorry to bother you," she said gently. "This was delivered to my door by mistake." I forced a small smile and accepted the box. "Thank you." She hesitated, her eyes soft with concern. "Are you all right, dear? You look pale." I exhaled quietly. "Long night." She nodded like she understood more than she let on. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." I thanked her again and closed the door. I set the package aside, my attention pulled right back into the swirl of thoughts I had been fighting. The conversation with my dad, the way he had framed my concerns as disloyalty, the way he had said he would do what was necessary, and now, the clarity that came afterward. The birthday party was not spontaneous. It had been planned, organized, structured, a stage. A stage designed not to celebrate me, but to humiliate me, to rewrite the narrative before anyone else could question him, to cast me as the problem so no one would look too closely at him. He had told me the day before the party that he would make a difficult decision if I continued to push, and then he made it, in public, under chandeliers and soft music and champagne glasses raised by people who believed they were witnessing a family celebration. Instead, they witnessed the beginning of a cover-up. I walked back to the kitchen and opened the folder Patrick had given me again, my hands steadier now than they had been earlier. The more I thought about that conversation with my dad, the more the pieces aligned. He had not been warning me, he had been preparing me for the moment he would sever any association between us so that whatever storm was coming would fall on me instead of him. I sat down at the counter and took a slow breath. The memory of his voice echoed again. "You will force me to make a difficult decision." The decision had already been made. I just had not realized it. Not until last night. Not until he stood under the ballroom lights and erased me from his life without hesitation. I closed the folder and rested my fingertips on the cover. Something inside me shifted then, something subtle but undeniable. It was the moment I stopped hoping this could be fixed privately. The moment I understood that the truth needed to be uncovered no matter how uncomfortable or painful the path would be. Outside my window, the late morning light had deepened into a muted brightness. I watched a few cars pass by, the city moving at its usual pace while everything inside me accelerated. My dad had warned me to stop digging, but warnings mean nothing when the truth is already reaching the surface. I pushed the folder aside and stood up. There was still so much I did not know, but I knew enough to understand this. Whatever he was hiding was bigger than a single fund or a mistaken report, bigger than a handful of suspicious transactions, bigger than one meeting or one confrontation. And the more I remembered that conversation before my birthday, the more I felt something dark settling beneath the surface. He had been preparing for a reckoning, and he had hoped I would be the shield. But he had miscalculated something important. I was done being quiet, and whatever was coming next, I would not face it blind. That certainty stayed with me as I walked from the kitchen to the living room, the light outside shifting into a pale afternoon gray. I picked up my phone from the couch, expecting a message from Patrick or maybe Ruth. Instead, the screen lit up with notifications I did not expect and did not want. 10 missed calls, 6 voicemails, dozens of text messages. But it was the video alert that made my stomach tighten. Someone had sent me a link. No caption, no explanation, just a link. I tapped it. The video opened instantly, grainy at first, the image shaking as if someone had been holding their phone against their chest to avoid being noticed. But even through the blur, I recognized the ballroom, the chandeliers, the flowers my mom had chosen, the soft glow over the crowd. And then I heard his voice, my dad's voice, clear, controlled, cold. From this moment forward, you are no longer my daughter. Hearing it again, without the shock of the moment, without the noise of the room, without the adrenaline numbing my reaction, felt entirely different. The words sounded sharper, crueler. Deliberate in a way I had not allowed myself to feel that night. The camera shifted toward me. The crowd parted slightly, revealing my face. Calm, still, holding a champagne glass at my side as if the ground beneath me had not cracked open. Understood, Dad. My voice was steady, almost quiet. Then the footage ended abruptly, a shaky cut. The sound of people whispering, someone saying, "What on earth just happened?" And then silence. I swallowed hard and set the phone down, my pulse tapping softly at my wrist. It was one thing for a ballroom full of people to witness what he did. It was something entirely different for the moment to be circulating through investor circles, through industry networks, through people who had power and influence and a stake in Halstead's strategic capital. The next message came from a private number. It contained only 3 words: "We need answers." I felt a cold ripple move down my spine. Investors. It had to be investors. Because when powerful people lose confidence, they ask questions. And when their questions are ignored, they start digging. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from one of the senior portfolio managers I had known for years. He was not someone who reached out casually. Is what happened last night related to the Riverway Fund issues? Then another message. Another demand for clarity. Another person wondered whether my dad's public outburst was connected to the performance of the firm's newest investment products. The more I scrolled, the more obvious it became. The video had spread faster than anyone anticipated, faster than my dad likely imagined when he made that announcement, and now the questions were beginning. I sank down onto the couch, leaning back slowly. My throat felt tight as another memory pressed itself into my mind, a memory from just a few weeks earlier. One I had brushed aside at the time because I had been too busy, too tired, too caught up in internal battles to realize its importance. I had been sitting at my desk when a call came through from a financial journalist named Calvin Rhodes. His voice had carried the smooth confidence of someone used to uncovering uncomfortable truths. He said he was working on a piece about emerging real estate investments in the Southwest and had questions about the Riverway Fund. Specifically, he said, he wanted information about why investors had filed small inquiries regarding delayed documentation. He said some of the publicly available development records did not align with the projected timeline. He said he wanted clarification from the company. I remembered glancing at the documents on my desk. I remembered the sharp concern that had sparked inside me, the way his questions had aligned too neatly with the things I had been trying to address internally. His tone had been polite, but the kind of polite that hides determination beneath it. Before I could answer, I heard a knock on my open office door. It was one of the communications directors. She gestured toward her office and mouthed, "I will handle it." I told Calvin someone from the communications team would return his call. He thanked me, and the line disconnected. A few minutes later, I overheard the director speaking with my dad behind closed doors. Their voices are low, urgent. When she emerged, she avoided looking directly at me. Later that afternoon, I asked my dad about the journalist's questions. He waved a hand dismissively and said reporters were always trying to create trouble. He said giving them attention would only make things worse. He said strong companies do not answer to noise. That had bothered me. Not because journalists were always right, but because ignoring inquiries often meant there was something worth hiding. Truth does not mind being seen. Lies do. I exhaled slowly now, as that moment replayed in my mind with new context. Calvin Rhodes had sensed something then, and now the video had confirmed for people like him that something deeper was happening inside the Halstead family. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email alert. I opened it reluctantly. The subject line made my teeth clench. Concern regarding Halstead Strategic Capital. It was from an investment group in New York, one of the largest contributors to multiple company funds. They wrote that they had seen footage from the party. They were alarmed by the tone and content of my dad's announcement. They wanted assurance that internal leadership remained stable and that recent issues were being addressed appropriately. They requested a call by the end of the week. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the pressure of the situation settle like a weight against my ribs. This was exactly what my dad feared. Not the truth itself, but the consequences of the truth. The loss of reputation, the loss of confidence, the loss of power. He had tried to sever himself from me to protect himself, but instead that public servant had pointed every flashlight directly at him. Another message arrived from Patrick. You need to see the front page of the regional investor newsletter. My stomach tightened as I opened the link he sent. There it was, a blurry screenshot of the video. The headline was not dramatic, but it was pointed. Halstead CEO makes public family announcement. Stability questions arise. Below that was a short article mentioning the Riverway Fund concerns and whispers about rapid product development inside the company. It asked whether leadership tension might reflect deeper operational issues. I blinked slowly as I read. A strange mix of dread and inevitability washed through me. Everything my dad had tried to avoid by isolating me was now happening in real time. The phone vibrated again. Another message. Then another. Investors. Former colleagues. A few friends. Even one board member whose tone felt less curious and more anxious. People were worried. People were wondering. People were circling. I set the phone aside before I drowned in the noise. I walked to the window and looked at the street below. Cars moved steadily through the afternoon traffic. People walked with purpose, unaware of the unraveling taking shape just a few floors above them. But inside my apartment, the walls felt too close. The air is still. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and took a slow breath. The video was more than an embarrassing moment. It was evidence. Evidence of instability. Evidence of a family fracture. Evidence that something was wrong inside the leadership of Halstead Strategic Capital. And in the world of finance, instability is a scent sharks can smell miles away. My thoughts drifted back again, uninvited but persistent, to that phone call from the journalist weeks earlier. His questions had not been random. He had been circling something, trying to find the soft spots in the story the company wanted to present. If he had sensed inconsistency then, he would be ravenous now. My phone rang loudly, breaking into my thoughts. I jumped slightly at the sudden noise. I picked it up hesitantly. It was one of the senior investors I had met during a conference in Florida a couple of years ago. His voice was clipped, professional, but strained in a way he could not fully hide. Margot, I apologize for calling out of the blue. I assume you already know the video is circulating. I closed my eyes. Yes, I know. He hesitated. There is concern about recent fund performance, and now this. I need to know if the company is structurally sound. Something inside me stiffened. I cannot speak on behalf of the company. Another pause. Then he said, Then tell me this. Should I be worried? His question hit me in a way I did not expect. Not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud would feel like crossing a line I could never step back from. I said nothing, and in that silence he seemed to understand. Thank you, he said softly. That tells me more than you think. He ended the call. I stared down at the phone in my hand, feeling the tremor of everything shifting around me. The video had not just begun the rumors. It had begun unraveling. My dad had tried to erase me to protect himself. Instead, he had lit the fuse. I walked back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and placed my hands flat against the surface. The folder Patrick had given me still sat there, quiet and damning. The weight of what was inside it pressed into my palms. The video was spreading. Investors were questioning. Journalists were circling. And whatever stability the company once had was slipping fast. I stared at the folder, my breath steadying slowly. That truth settled into my chest as the sun disappeared behind the buildings outside my window. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across my apartment walls. I had barely slept since the party, but exhaustion did nothing to quiet my thoughts. The world outside stayed steady, but everything inside me was shifting faster than I could catch it. By the third morning after the party, I woke up to my phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was just more investor messages, or more news alerts about the video. But when I picked up the phone and saw the lock screen, my breath caught. 58 missed calls, all from my dad. The number sat on the screen like a bruise. 58 attempts in less than 24 hours. I stared at it, numb, the weight of all those unanswered calls pressing into me. He had not called me once during the months I tried to speak with him calmly about the fund issues. He had not called me once after he publicly erased me from his life. But now that the pressure was turning toward him instead of away, he could not stop calling. I set the phone down and walked slowly into the kitchen, the apartment still dim. The silence in the room felt different now, not peaceful, heavy. My phone buzzed again, a message from Patrick. I have more documents. You need to see these. I sat down at the counter, my hands wrapping around a mug of coffee I had no intention of drinking. My laptop was still open from the night before. I clicked on the secure link Patrick sent. A new folder appeared, filled with spreadsheets, transaction logs, email traces, and internal memos. But it was the chart at the top that made my stomach twist. He had mapped out the transactions visually this time. Lines connecting transfers from fund to vendor, vendor to consulting firm to holding company back into private accounts. Dozens of lines, some faint, some bold, all crossing paths in a web that looked almost artistic in its complexity, except it was not art. It was structure. Deliberate. Intentional. In the center of the chart, Patrick had marked 4 consulting companies in red, the ones receiving the largest volume of money. The names were generic, empty shells on paper. But what connected them was not the names. It was the timing. Each company had been created within 60 days of a major fund launch. Each had received payments within 2 weeks of investor deposits, and each had split the money within 72 hours into accounts traced to unverified beneficiaries. As I scrolled through the documents, the pattern became clearer. It no longer looked like sloppy accounting or inconsistent oversight. It looked like a system designed to move money quickly before anyone could tie it to a single source. A knock came at my door, soft but urgent. I startled slightly, still on edge from everything. When I opened it, Patrick stood there with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, the kind of tiredness that settles into a person when they have stared too long at something they cannot unsee. I stepped back to let him in. He placed his backpack on the table and pulled out more files, real printed files. Once he had taken the risk to bring physically instead of digitally. I asked softly, "You barely slept, did you?" He shook his head. "Margot, this is bigger than anything I imagined, and your dad knows it. That is why he is calling." I swallowed hard. 58 calls. Patrick exhaled a long breath. Then he spread the documents across the table, each one opening a deeper layer of the truth. I asked a question I was almost afraid to hear the answer to. How bad is it? He rubbed the back of his neck. It is not just one fund, not just 2. It is almost every product pushed out by senior management for the last 18 months. Real estate, energy, tech partnerships. All tied together by these transfers. I leaned over the documents, feeling the room get smaller around me. My eyes traced the names of investors, small business owners, retirees, families who had trusted the Halstead name for decades, people who believed in the legacy my grandfather built. Patrick pointed at one transaction, this one especially. $3.8 million moved out of the fund and into a shell company within 10 days, and then gone. My pulse thudded in my ears. My grandfather had spent his entire life building a reputation of transparency, and my dad had taken that reputation and used it as cover. I whispered, "I should have caught this sooner." Patrick shook his head firmly. "No, you were being pushed out of every meeting where real decisions were being made. They isolated you so your objections would be easy to dismiss." I nodded slowly, the truth settling deeper. My dad had not just disagreed with me, he had systematically removed my influence, step by step, decision by decision. And now, after humiliating me publicly, he suddenly needed me again, not out of love, but out of fear. Patrick sat across from me, his voice low. There is something else. He opened an email on his tablet and turned it toward me. My breath stopped. It was from the Securities and Exchange Commission, an official request for documentation. They were requesting financial records for 4 funds. The very funds we had been dissecting for days. They wanted transaction logs, compliance reports, vendor records. They wanted explanations. They wanted transparency. They had given the company 10 business days to comply. My hand trembled as I read. I knew what this meant. I knew exactly what those requests signified. The SEC does not ask politely unless they already suspect a violation, and they do not investigate lightly unless they already see smoke. Patrick said quietly, "They know something is wrong." I could barely speak. "Does the company know about this yet?" He nodded. "The email was sent to senior leadership this morning." My heart clenched. My dad, Vanessa, the board members, every executive who had been part of aligning themselves with decisions that pushed through those funds. Patrick looked at me with something that felt like both fear and resolve. "They will try to bury this. You and I both know that. They will scramble, create their own narrative, and try to blame you. That video makes it easy. They will say you were unstable or acting out or trying to damage the company." I closed my eyes, realizing the trap. The birthday spectacle had not just been humiliation, it had been preparation. A setup. A way to establish a story long before the real accusations arrived. I whispered. "He knew this investigation was coming." Patrick nodded. "Or he suspected, and he wanted to cut you out before it landed, to make sure everything fell on someone else." My hands curled into fists on the table. The calls, the sudden desperation, the lack of messages before this, all of it clicked into place. My dad wanted me to shield him. He wanted me to be the one to explain everything to the SEC, to handle the fallout, to take the blame if necessary. And if the company collapsed under scrutiny, he wanted the story to be simple. The daughter he disowned caused the problem. I opened my eyes and felt something inside me sharpen. Patrick asked softly, "Are you going to call him back?" I shook my head slowly. "No." He nodded. "Good." Then he said something that felt heavier than all the documents combined. "You need to understand something. When a man like your dad feels cornered, he will do anything to survive." I stared at the SEC email again. The request for transparency. The formal tone. The thinly veiled warning. Then I looked at the web of documents Patrick had brought, and finally at my silent phone, still vibrating occasionally with more attempts from my dad. 58 calls. I did not need to listen to a single one to know exactly what he would say. He would sound calm at first, then concerned, then controlled, then furious, then pleading, then threatening, then rational again. The full circle of manipulation. A performance he had perfected over years of leadership. But this was not a conversation I could have anymore. I stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, a few snowflakes drifted down, catching the light as they fell. The city below moved without knowing how much power was shifting above it. I whispered more to myself than to Patrick. "Everything is unraveling." He stepped beside me, his voice steady, not unraveling, revealing. I closed my eyes. He was right. This was not collapse. This was exposure. The truth walking into the light, whether anyone welcomed it or not. Behind me, my phone vibrated again. I did not look at it. Instead, I turned back toward the table filled with documents, ready to face whatever came next, even if I was standing at the edge of something I could not yet see. That edge arrived faster than I imagined. Less than 24 hours later, an email landed in my inbox requesting my presence at an emergency board meeting. No explanation, no agenda, just a time and a location inside the Halstead Strategic Capital headquarters. A building I had not walked into since the night everything cracked open. I stared at the email for a long minute, the cursor blinking as if urging me to choose. Patrick sat across the table, watching me without pressure. When I finally looked up, he nodded once. "You have to go." If you do not, they will decide the narrative without you." His voice carried a calm weight I leaned into. He was right. If I stayed silent now, I would become exactly what my dad wanted me to be: the problem, the scapegoat, the explanation for every shadow he had cast. So the next morning, I dressed in a navy suit, tied my hair back, and walked out of my apartment with the folder of documents tucked under my arm. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight with anticipation. The streets were wet from a light snow that had melted under early traffic. As I drove toward the office, the glass building appeared through the winter haze like a place I no longer recognized. People turned their heads when I entered the lobby. A few paused mid-step. Others looked down quickly. The silence inside the elevator felt colder than the weather outside. When the doors opened to the executive floor, the tension met me instantly. The boardroom was already full. 12 members. A long polished table. A wall of windows overlooking the harbor. My dad stood at the far end, speaking quietly with Vanessa, her expression strained. He looked up when I walked in. His eyes widened just slightly, then narrowed into the cool, controlled look he used when he wanted to intimidate someone. I chose a seat near the center, laying my folder on the table. No one spoke. The quiet pulsed with something sharp. The board chair, an older man with silver hair and a steady presence, asked everyone to sit. My dad remained standing. That alone told me how he planned to begin. He cleared his throat slowly, then addressed the room with a calmness that sounded practiced. "There have been recent misunderstandings regarding company direction." He kept his eyes fixed on the board, deliberately avoiding mine. "I want to clarify immediately that the concerns being raised originate from an internal source that has been unstable and unfortunately misinformed." My jaw tightened. He continued, speaking with the tone he used to charm investors. "The outburst at my daughter's birthday was personal. It was emotional. It should never have become public. But it does reflect a deeper issue. She has been acting outside her role and creating confusion around legitimate strategic decisions." I felt heat rise in my chest. He was framing the story exactly as I expected. Calm. Reasonable. Father as leader trying to correct a misguided daughter. He even pressed a hand to his chest, a gesture that made him look wounded rather than responsible. One board member asked what specific concerns he meant. My dad responded smoothly. "She has been questioning approved transactions, undermining management, and misinterpreting internal processes. We believe her behavior is connected to personal matters rather than factual company issues." Another board member asked about the SEC inquiry. My dad exhaled, heavy and staged. "A routine audit request," he said. "Nothing unusual. Our teams are gathering documents now. Unfortunately, her actions have made the request appear more significant than it is." I could feel eyes shifting toward me, some skeptical, some confused. My dad stepped closer to the table and added in a softer voice meant to sound compassionate. "This is a family matter as much as a corporate one. I ask that the board give us space to handle it privately." Privately, meaning quietly, meaning invisibly. Before the board chair could respond, I spoke. "No." The word cut through the room with a force I did not plan but could not take back. My dad's head snapped toward me. His jaw tightened. Vanessa's eyes widened, then narrowed. I reached for my folder and opened it with deliberate calm. I looked at the board members, one by one. I said that there are no misunderstandings. And nothing about this is personal. The issues I raised are documented, repeated, and ignored at multiple levels of management. My dad stepped forward quickly. "Margot, this is not the time." I held up a hand, stopping him without touching him. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I said that I would like to show the board what led to my concerns. I slid several printed emails onto the center of the table. Emails from analysts showing risk warnings. Emails from compliance teams requesting additional review. Emails in which senior management, under pressure from my dad, pushed through product launches without adequate documentation. Patrick stood from his seat at the far side of the room. The board had invited him as a neutral observer since he worked in compliance. He approached the table slowly, placing another stack of documents beside mine. He said that the transactions we have been reviewing indicate consistent irregularities across multiple funds. He kept his tone steady, free of accusation, but the words landed with weight. The movement of money through consulting companies with no verified operations is not consistent with standard procedures. My dad's face shifted from irritation to quiet panic. He tried to regain control. These accounts were approved by external partners. He attempted to laugh lightly. This is being exaggerated. She is looking for problems that are not there. Patrick shook his head calmly. The data stands on its own. He tapped the documents. These transactions bypassed normal review processes and were approved by senior leadership under your direction. The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself thickened. One board member leaned forward, studying the documents. Another asked to see the full pattern of transfers. A third asked why warnings from analysts were dismissed. My dad's voice shook slightly as he tried to respond. He said the warnings were routine, that analysts are trained to be overly cautious, that growth requires risk. I stood slowly. My voice stayed steady. Risk is not the problem. Deception is. I said that these transactions are tied to companies that do not exist outside paper filings. Money is being routed in ways that no investor was informed about, and there is a reason the SEC is asking for documentation. This is not routine. My dad slammed a hand on the table. Enough. His voice cracked with anger he could no longer hide. You are attacking your family and your company because you cannot handle being told no. The board chair raised a hand gently. Robert, sit down. My dad stared at him, shocked, as if he had expected unwavering loyalty. But the chair's eyes were fixed on the documents in front of him, not on the man who had led the company for almost 2 decades. I continued. The truth is that multiple funds have been used to redirect money through shell companies. Investors were not informed, internal teams were silenced, and when I asked questions, I was removed from meetings. Then I was publicly disowned. The moment it became clear someone outside the company was starting to investigate. That last sentence sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. A board member asked my dad directly whether he knew about the consulting companies. He hesitated for one fraction of a second too long. Then he lied. No. Patrick opened another folder. Actually, these approvals came from your office. He pointed at the signatures. These are not clerical errors. They are deliberate. My dad's face was drained of color. For the first time, the room shifted toward me, not with sympathy. With clarity, they saw it now. The cracks. The concealment. The pattern. The board chair spoke quietly but firmly, addressing my dad. Robert, given what we have seen today, we need full transparency. I am requesting immediate internal audit cooperation along with your temporary removal from operational authority until the investigation is complete. My dad stared at him, stunned. You cannot do that. Another board member responded softly. We can, and we must. The shift was complete. Power moved in that instant. Not loudly, not dramatically. It moved with the quiet certainty that truth always brings when denial finally collapses. My dad looked at me then, not with authority, not with anger, with something closer to disbelief, as if he had never imagined I would stand on the opposite side of him, as if loyalty meant silence. The meeting continued, but I barely heard the rest. Questions were assigned, documents collected, timelines established. The board took action. When the meeting adjourned, everyone began to file out slowly. My dad stayed seated, staring at the table. I stepped toward the door but paused, my hand resting lightly on the frame. I said quietly, You tried to erase me, Dad. But the only thing you erased was your chance to hide. He did not respond. He did not look up. I walked out of the boardroom, feeling the weight that had pressed on me for months begin to shift. Not disappear, but move, finally move. And later that week, everything that had been hanging in the balance came to a decision no one in my family could stop. The emergency board meeting reconvened 48 hours after the first one. Snow drifted across the harbor that morning, thin flakes tapping softly against the windows as if trying to warn us that something irreversible was coming. I walked into the boardroom with a quiet steadiness, carrying only a notebook and the folder that had become the center of every sleepless night. My dad sat at the far end of the table, his shoulders rigid, his expression unreadable. Mom was beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine. Vanessa sat 2 seats over, tapping her fingernails lightly against the pen, trying to look composed but failing to hide the tension around her mouth. The board chair called the meeting to order. The tone was more solemn this time, more final. The documents had been reviewed, the transaction patterns analyzed, the SEC inquiry acknowledged, and the truth was no longer something that could be argued or brushed aside. The chair spoke clearly. The board has reviewed the evidence and the statements presented. In order to protect the integrity of Halstead Strategic Capital and the interests of our investors, we will now vote on the removal of Robert Halstead as Chief Executive Officer. My dad inhaled sharply, ready to object, but the chair raised a hand. No further discussion will be taken at this moment. One by one, the board members cast their votes aloud. Remove, remove, remove. Each word hit the table like a steady hammer, not loud, but unshakable. My dad's eyes darted from face to face, disbelief and indignation tightening his jaw. When the final vote was cast, the chair folded his hands and spoke again. The motion passes. My dad pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs scraping against the polished floor. His voice cracked with fury. You are making a mistake. All of you. She started this. She poisoned this room. The chair remained calm. The documents speak for themselves. Mom's hand moved toward him slightly, trembling, but he pulled his arm away before she could touch him. He stared at me then, a stare filled with something far more raw than anger. It was the look of a man who had lost control of every piece on the board and could not understand how. I met his gaze without flinching. This was not a victory. It was truth taking the place it always deserved. Security escorted him out minutes later. Mom followed behind him quietly. Vanessa stayed seated, staring at her hands like she had forgotten how they worked. She did not look at me once. When the room emptied and only the board chair remained, he approached me gently. He placed a hand on the table beside me and said in a soft voice, "Your grandfather would be proud of what you did, not because you fought, but because you told the truth when it mattered." I swallowed hard, the words hitting me deeper than I expected. "Thank you." He nodded. "We will make sure the employees who were blamed are cleared. The company will survive this because of what you brought forward." When I left the building, the cold air felt sharper but somehow cleaner. The sky was a bright winter blue. People hurried across the sidewalks with scarves pulled tight, unaware that a legacy had just been stripped down to its bones inside the glass building behind me. Over the next week, word spread internally that the analysts had been cleared of all wrongdoing. Ruth received an apology from the new acting leadership along with reinstated responsibilities and a formal acknowledgement of her diligence. Others who had been quietly threatened with demotion were now being asked to rejoin compliance efforts to help organize files for the SEC. Every time I walked through the office halls to finalize my remaining duties, employees stopped me. Some placed a hand on my arm. Some whispered thank you. Some simply nodded with a look that said they understood what this had cost me. But the hardest part came when I realized something else with absolute clarity. My place was no longer inside that building, not because I was unwelcome, but because I had reached the end of the path that belonged to my grandfather's dream. The company he built had become something different long before I tried to save it, and though the board was committed to repairing the damage, my own chapter there was closing. One morning, I sat at my desk for the last time. The office was quiet, sunlight stretching across the floor. I ran my fingers lightly over the framed photo of my grandfather that had sat on my bookshelf since my first day. He stood beside the original office sign, smiling in the wind with a certainty I had always admired. I whispered into the stillness, "I hope I did this the way you would have wanted." I packed my things slowly, placing only the essentials into a small box. The rest I left behind. Files, documents, unfinished reports, even the old desk plant that had outlived 2 office moves. They belonged to a version of me who stayed because of loyalty, because of fear, because of hope that someone could be pulled back from a path they chose willingly. I walked out of the building with the box in my arms, breathing deeply as if pulling air into a place inside me that had been empty for a long time. Outside, Patrick waited on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. He smiled softly when he saw me. "So that is it." I nodded. "That is it." He walked with me to my car, and before I opened the door, he said, "You know you are going to be in demand." Clients will line up to work with someone who stood up to her own CEO and protected investors. I laughed quietly, a small, tired laugh. I guess I am starting something new. Something good, he added. Something honest. He was right. And deep down, I had known for weeks what direction I was heading: compliance consulting, helping companies keep their promises instead of bending them, helping people understand the structures they trusted. I did not want to be the shield for someone else's deception ever again. When I finally got home, I placed the box on my dining table and sat for a long moment in silence. Then I opened the last drawer of the buffet cabinet and pulled out my grandfather's old notebook, the one he used when he first started Halstead Strategic Capital as a tiny advisory office in Maine. Inside the front cover, he had written a single line: "Reputation is not what you say, it is what you refuse to compromise." I ran my thumb over the faded ink, hearing his voice in my head as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. I thought about my dad, about the moment he grabbed the microphone at my birthday and cut me out of his world. I thought about the calls I ignored and the consequences that unfolded after. I thought about the employees who had been blamed, the investors who trusted us, the truth that refused to stay hidden, and I realized something that felt both painful and freeing. Sometimes integrity costs you the people who should have protected you the most, but losing them is not failure, it is released. I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet Boston street below, and felt the weight inside me shift again. Lighter this time. More certain. The story I carried forward now was no longer about my dad, or the company, or even the scandal itself. It was about reclaiming the legacy my grandfather meant to protect. Not the building, not the brand, but the principle behind it: transparency, responsibility, truth. Values he lived by even when no one was watching. I turned away from the window and let out a slow breath. And that is when I knew I was finally ready to tell this story, not as something that broke me, but as something that shaped me. I want to end this chapter of my life the same way my grandfather would have ended it: with honesty, with clarity, with a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is hold your ground when everyone around you wants you quiet. If you have ever been told you are too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.